On a Tuesday morning in October, my son called me from 1,400 miles away. He'd just gotten off the phone with his bank. He said, "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." And then he said this: "The $2,400 I've been sending you every single month for the past 3 years. Are you actually receiving it? Because the woman I'm married to just told me you called her last week and said it still wasn't enough." I hadn't received a single dollar, not one, and I had never called her, not once. Now, before I tell you everything that happened, and I mean everything, because this story goes so much deeper than missing money, I need you to understand something first. Because when my son said those words to me, my first instinct wasn't anger. It wasn't even confusion. It was this slow, cold feeling that crept up my spine, like something I'd already sensed but refused to name had just walked through the front door and introduced itself. There was $86,400 missing. 3 years, 36 payments. Gone. And someone had been feeding my son a story, a very specific, very detailed story, about me, about my behavior, about things I supposedly said and did, a story designed to make him believe that his elderly mother was either becoming unstable or ungrateful, or both. But here's what I didn't know yet. The missing money was only part of it, because while I was sitting in my small house, wondering why my son never came to visit, wondering why our phone calls had become shorter and colder over the past 2 years, wondering why he sometimes spoke to me with this careful, unguarded tone, like he was managing a situation instead of talking to his mother. Something else entirely had been happening, and it involved my grandchildren, and a document I had never signed. I'll get to that. I promise you, I'll get to that. But you need to understand who I am first. You need to understand where I was when all of this started, because without that, you won't feel the full weight of what I'm about to tell you. My name is Margaret. Most people who've known me for more than 5 minutes call me Maggie. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years teaching 4th grade at the same elementary school in a small city in North Carolina. I never made a lot of money. Teachers rarely do, but I loved what I did. I loved those children. I loved the rhythm of it. The school year, the summer, the smell of chalk and construction paper, and the specific kind of hope that lives in a room full of 9-year-olds. My husband, Gerald, died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. That's how fast it took him. Gerald and I had been married for 43 years. We met in a laundromat. He'd put his red shirt in with my white blouse and turned everything pink. He was so embarrassed. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. We were married 11 months later. When he died, I won't pretend that the financial situation was easy. Gerald had worked in manufacturing his whole life. We had some savings. We had a modest pension between the two of us. But the medical bills from those 6 weeks, even with insurance, ate through nearly everything we'd set aside. And my teacher's pension, which had felt adequate when there were 2 of us, suddenly felt very thin when I was the only one paying the power bill, the property taxes, the car insurance. I didn't tell my son how tight things were at first. I didn't want him to worry. His name is Daniel. He's 41. He works in corporate finance in Chicago. He married Vanessa, I'll get to her, 9 years ago. They have 2 children together, my grandchildren, Liam, who is 7, and Sophie, who is 4. Daniel is a good man. I need you to hear that, because everything that follows is going to test your picture of him, and I want you to hold on to the fact that at the core of it, he is a good man who was deceived. About 2 months after Gerald died, Daniel called me and said he wanted to help. Now, he said he'd been running the numbers and he thought he could send $2,400 a month. He said, "Mom, it's not charity, it's family. Dad would have wanted this." I cried. I'm not ashamed to say that. I cried and I told him he didn't have to do that. He said he was setting up the transfers immediately. We talked about it for a few more minutes. He sounded warm. He sounded like himself, like my Daniel. And that was the last time, I now realize, that I spoke to my son without Vanessa's version of me already taking root in his mind. Because here's what I didn't know then. Vanessa had been listening to that entire phone call. The first month after Daniel said he was sending money, nothing arrived. I checked my account. Nothing. I assumed there'd been a delay with the bank transfer. I didn't want to make it awkward by calling and asking about it right away, so I waited another 2 weeks. Still nothing. I called Daniel. He seemed surprised I was asking. He said, "Mom, I set it up. It should have gone through. Let me check with Vanessa. She handles our accounts." Within 20 minutes, he called me back. He said Vanessa had confirmed the transfer had gone out. He said maybe there was an issue with my bank, and could I double-check? I went to my bank the next morning. I spoke with a teller I'd known for years, a woman named Cynthia. She looked through my accounts carefully. There was no incoming transfer. Not pending, not failed. Nothing. I called Daniel back. He seemed a little less warm this time, a little more careful. He said, "Vanessa says she has the confirmation number. She'll send it to your email." The email came. There was a screenshot. A bank confirmation showing a transfer of $2,400 to an account ending in 7741. My account ends in 2209. I told Daniel this. There was a long pause. Then Vanessa got on the phone. This was the first time she'd spoken to me directly during this whole exchange, and something about the way she handled it, the way she stepped in exactly at the moment when a discrepancy appeared, registered somewhere in the back of my mind. I didn't act on that feeling, but I noticed it. She told me, very calmly, very kindly, that when Daniel set up the transfer, he must have entered my account number incorrectly from an old check I'd once sent them. She said she would fix it right away. She apologized. She was charming about it. She called me Maggie Honey. I believed her. And the next month, money appeared in my account. $2,400. Right on time. For 2 months, it was regular. Reliable. I exhaled. I stopped worrying about the gas bill. I bought a few things I'd been putting off. I started to feel less like I was treading water. And then, on the 3rd month, it stopped again. I waited a week, checked every day. Nothing. I called Daniel. He sounded distracted when he answered. He said, "It should be there, Mom. Vanessa sent it." I said, "Daniel, it isn't here." He said he'd look into it. He didn't call back that day, or the next. When I called him again 3 days later, there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before, a slight distance, like he was carefully measuring what he said. He told me that Vanessa had confirmed the transfer went through. Well, he said his bank showed the money leaving their account. He said, "Mom, are you sure you're checking the right account? You have 2, right?" "I only have 1 account." I told him this. He said, Okay, we'll figure it out." But here's the thing that didn't add up, and I kept turning it over in my mind even then, even when I was still giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. If the money was leaving their account, where was it going? And why did I feel, each time I raised this question, like I was the one creating a problem? Let me tell you about my neighbor Doris. Doris is 73. She's a retired bookkeeper. She's sharp as a tack, blunt as a butter knife, and she has 0 patience for nonsense in any form. She's also been my closest friend for 19 years, which she brought food to my house every day for the 2 weeks after Gerald died without ever once asking me if I needed it. She just showed up. That's the kind of person she is. I told Doris about the money situation over coffee one afternoon. I laid it all out. The 2 months it came through, then stopped. Daniel's explanations, Vanessa's involvement. Doris set down her mug and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before. She said, "Maggie, a transfer either lands or it doesn't. There's no in-between. If the money is leaving his account and not arriving in yours, it's going somewhere." I knew that. But what she said next is what opened the first real crack in my thinking. She said, "You said his bank shows the money leaving. Has he ever showed you that statement? Or is it just her saying that it shows the money leaving?" I went very still. I had never seen an actual bank statement from Daniel. Everything I knew about those transfers had come through Vanessa. The confirmation screenshots, the account number explanation, all of it. I had simply assumed Daniel had seen the same things she was showing me. I called Daniel that evening. I asked him directly, gently, carefully, if he had personally looked at the statements showing those transfers leaving the account. Another pause, then he said, "Vanessa handles all of that, Mom. She's been managing our finances since we got married. It's just easier that way." I said, "Daniel, I'm not attacking Vanessa. I just want to understand where the money is going, because it's genuinely not reaching me." He got quiet, and then he said something that hit me like cold water. He said, "She told me you might push back on this. She said you've been a little confused lately. She said you called her last month and didn't remember the conversation the next day." I had not called Vanessa. Not last month, not the month before. I hadn't called Vanessa in almost 8 months. I said, "Daniel, I did not call her." He said, "Mom." In that careful, managing tone, she showed me the call log. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was hurt, though I was, but because I suddenly realized that this was not a banking error. Someone had constructed a very deliberate system, and that system had 2 components. One was financial. The other was reputational. The money was being redirected, and I was being characterized as unreliable, confused, and difficult, so that when I raised questions about the money, my son's first instinct would be to doubt me rather than doubt the person redirecting it. I lay in the dark that night, and I felt something clarify inside me. Not anger, not panic, something colder, something strategic. I thought, if someone has gone to this much trouble, there is much more here than I can currently see. And I thought, I am not going to react. I am going to find out. The first thing I did was write down every single thing I could remember about every conversation I'd had with Daniel in the past 2.5 years. Every change in tone, every moment where he seemed guarded, every time Vanessa had been present or had stepped in. Every detail, no matter how small. It took me 4 hours. I filled 11 pages of a yellow legal pad. When I read back through what I'd written, a pattern emerged that made me feel sick. It wasn't random. The cooling of our relationship, the way Daniel's calls had gotten shorter, the way he'd stopped suggesting visits, the way he occasionally referenced things I had allegedly said or done that I had no memory of. It all tracked back to a specific period, about 30 months ago, right around when the money arrangement had started, which meant that the narrative being built about me, confused, unreliable, difficult, had been running parallel to the financial deception from the very beginning. This wasn't opportunistic. This was designed. I went back to my bank, but this time, I didn't just talk to Cynthia at the teller window. I made an appointment with the branch manager, a man named Howard Briggs, who I'd dealt with when Gerald and I refinanced the house years ago. I laid out the situation as plainly as I could. I said, "Money is being sent to me from an account in Illinois. It is not arriving in my account. I need to understand the mechanism by which this could happen." Howard was careful. He explained that there are a limited number of explanations for this scenario. Either the transfers were never actually initiated, or they were initiated to a different account number, or they were initiated and then reversed before clearing. He asked me if I'd ever given my account information to anyone other than Daniel. I had not. He asked if I'd ever authorized anyone to receive money on my behalf. I had not. He said he could file an inquiry with their fraud department, but that the most important thing, if I believed there was intentional redirection occurring, was to get documentation from the sending bank confirming exactly where those funds had actually gone. That meant I needed Daniel to request those records himself. And I couldn't ask Daniel to do that without tipping my hand. Because by now, I had a very clear sense that if Vanessa knew I was investigating, things would change. Evidence might disappear. Stories might shift. I had to be invisible about this, so I took a different approach. I called my son's college roommate. His name is Phil. Phil Guerrero. He and Daniel have been close for 20 years. Phil is a CPA. He's also one of the most honest people I've ever met, and he loves Daniel like a brother. I had his number from a Christmas card years ago, and I'd always gotten along well with him. Phil picked up on the third ring. He was surprised to hear from me, but not unfriendly. I asked how he was. We made small talk for a few minutes, and then I asked if he knew how Daniel was doing. There was a pause. Phil said, "He's okay, Maggie. I think he's under a lot of pressure right now." I asked what kind of pressure. Phil hesitated. Then he said, "I probably shouldn't get into it, but are you two okay? Because he mentioned some concerns to me a few months ago about your health." I asked him what specifically. Phil said Vanessa had apparently told Daniel that she'd spoken to someone close to me. She hadn't named who had expressed concern that I was showing signs of cognitive decline. Forgetting things. Getting confused. I asked Phil, do I sound confused to you right now?" He laughed quietly. "No. You sound like you always have." I said, "Someone is building a case that I'm losing my mind. I believe it's because they've been intercepting money Daniel has been sending me for almost 3 years, and they need me to seem unreliable so that when I raise questions, no one believes me." Long silence. Then Phil said, very quietly, "Maggie, Daniel doesn't manage their accounts. He told me Vanessa handles everything. He said he checks in, but she runs the day-to-day." I said, "I know." Phil said, "What do you need?" I told him I needed someone Daniel trusted to gently, without accusation, ask Daniel to pull the full transfer history from their joint account. Not through Vanessa. Directly. Daniel himself logging into the bank. Phil said he would find a way to do it. Over the next 10 days, I waited. I kept my conversations with Daniel normal. I asked about the grandchildren. I laughed at his stories. I gave nothing away. But I was watching everything. I asked my friend Karen, who lives 2 streets over and has a daughter in Chicago, to casually check one thing for me. I'd been given a phone number once, years ago, that was listed as a secondary contact on a piece of insurance paperwork Vanessa had sent when she and Daniel had added me as a beneficiary on something. I wanted to know if that number was still active and whose name it was under. Karen's daughter ran it through a people search service she used for work. The number came back registered to a name I didn't recognize. A woman named Brianna Caldwell. I wrote that name down. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew it meant something. And that's when something else stopped feeling right. 3 days later, Doris came over with coffee and a piece of paper she'd printed from her computer. She'd been doing some searching on her own. I hadn't asked her to, but that's Doris for you. She set the paper in front of me. It was a property record for a condominium in Scottsdale, Arizona, purchased 14 months ago. The owner listed was Brianna Caldwell. I looked up from the paper. Doris said, "Keep reading." There was a lien on the property. A mortgage. The cosigner on the mortgage was Vanessa Caldwell Hartman. I stared at that name for a long time. Caldwell. Vanessa Caldwell Hartman. Brianna Caldwell. I said, "They have the same last name." Doris said, "Brianna Caldwell is Vanessa's younger sister. I found her on social media. She's 29. She lives in Scottsdale. I sat back in my chair. $2,400 a month. 36 months. $86,400. A condominium in Scottsdale purchased 14 months ago, with Vanessa as co-signer on the mortgage. I hadn't been receiving money for 3 years, but Vanessa's sister had been receiving it, steadily, reliably, month after month, and had used it, or at least part of it, to secure a property. The room felt very quiet. I said, "She set up an account using my name, or a variation of it, and had Daniel's transfers redirected there." Doris nodded slowly. "Or she gave him a slightly wrong account number in the beginning. Remember you told me about the first month, when she blamed a typo. And the corrected account was actually her sister's." And that's when I realized something that made everything else lock into place. And the 2 months when money had actually appeared in my account, those weren't mistakes. Those were test runs, demonstrations, so that if I ever raised an alarm, Daniel could point to those 2 months and say, "See, it worked. It's going through. Maybe Mom is confused." It had been a two-pronged strategy from the very beginning. Intercept the money, undermine the source. I sat in my kitchen with Doris across from me, and I thought about the fact that my daughter-in-law had sat across the dinner table from me at Christmas, had hugged me, had let me hold my grandchildren, had smiled at me and said, "I love you, Maggie," while all of this was happening. And I thought, I am going to be very, very careful now, because I was not going to lose this. Phil called me on a Thursday evening. His voice was different when I picked up. Tighter. He said, "Maggie, I looked at the accounts with Daniel." He paused. I said, "Tell me." He said, "Daniel thinks he's been sending you $2,400 a month. He logged in himself. I sat with him, said I wanted to understand his investment structure for some advice I was giving him." He pulled up the transfers. They're going to an account he labeled Mom, Hartman Support. He thinks it's your account. I said, "Phil, what are the last 4 digits of the account number in his system?" He told me the same number from the original screenshot. The account that Vanessa had said was a typo. The account that was never corrected to mine. I said, "My account ends in 2209. Complete silence from Phil. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "Maggie, he doesn't know." And that broke something open in me. Not into tears, but into a kind of clarity that was almost painful in its precision. Because the piece I hadn't been sure about, whether Daniel was complicit, whether he knew, that piece was now confirmed. He didn't know. He genuinely believed he'd been supporting me. He had been deceived just as completely as I had. And then Phil said, "There's something else?" I waited. He said, "While I had him pulling up accounts, he got a call." He stepped out of the room. I was alone with his laptop for a few minutes. He paused. I know I shouldn't have looked, but I did, because something felt wrong. He said he'd seen another account, a separate one. A savings account Vanessa had apparently opened in both their names 18 months ago, under a financial planning umbrella. It had a balance of just over $43,000, and the deposits were irregular. Some months nothing, some months several thousand at once. $43,000. Even accounting for the Scottsdale property, there was more money somewhere. Phil said, "I don't know what she's been doing, Maggie, but the amounts don't add up to just your transfers. There's more coming in from somewhere that I can't source. Either she has other income streams I don't know about, or..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because I already knew what the next question was. Was I the only one? I thought about who else in Vanessa's orbit might be sending money. Who else trusted her with accounts? Who else was at a point in life where they might be financially dependent on others and therefore vulnerable to this kind of thing? And then I thought about something Daniel had mentioned 18 months ago in passing. Something I hadn't registered at the time. He'd mentioned that Vanessa's mother, her biological mother, an elderly woman named Ruth who lived in Indiana, had recently moved into assisted living. He'd mentioned that Vanessa was helping manage her finances during the transition. Ruth Caldwell, 81 years old, in assisted living. Someone was managing her finances. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. I spent the next 3 days making calls I never thought I'd have to make. I found a number for the assisted living facility in Indiana through their website. I called and asked to speak with a staff member in their resident support department. I said I was a family friend of one of their residents, Ruth Caldwell, and that I had some concerns about her financial well-being that I didn't want to raise with family members directly because I wasn't sure who to trust. The woman I spoke with, her name was Teresa, was initially guarded. She said she couldn't discuss resident information. I said, "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to note my concern and pass it to whoever handles financial welfare issues for your residents. I believe Ruth may not have full control of her own accounts." Teresa said she would pass it along. I then called an attorney. His name is Robert Mace. He had handled the estate work when Gerald died. He's in his late 50s, meticulous, and he does not panic. I told him everything, from the beginning, all 11 pages of my notes. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maggie, what you're describing, if documented correctly, constitutes wire fraud at the federal level. If she's also taking from an elderly woman in assisted living, you're potentially looking at elder financial abuse charges on top of that, which carry separate enhanced penalties." He said, "Have you told Daniel any of this?" I said, "Not yet. I need him to be in the room when I do. I need him to hear everything at once. If I call him before I'm ready, she'll know, and things will disappear." Robert said, "Okay, here's what we need to do." He walked me through it step by step. I needed Daniel to formally request his own complete transfer history, in writing, from the bank. Not verbally, in writing with documentation. I needed a copy of the property record from Scottsdale, which Doris had already obtained. I needed a written confirmation from my bank that no transfers matching those amounts had ever arrived in my account. And I needed witnesses. People who had heard the story as it unfolded, who could speak to the timeline. Doris, Phil, Howard from the bank. Robert said, "I want you to gather everything, and then I want you to call Daniel and invite him to come see you. Don't tell him why. Tell him you miss him and the children, that it's been too long. Make it feel like the most natural thing in the world." I said, "And Vanessa?" He said, "Invite her too." I said, "You want her there?" He said, "I want her there." I called Daniel on a Sunday afternoon. My voice was warm, easy. I told him I'd been thinking about how long it had been since I'd seen the children. I said Liam must be so big now. I said I'd love it if they could come for a long weekend sometime before the holidays. I said I had some of Gerald's old things I wanted Daniel to have. His watch, some photographs, a box of letters he'd written me that I thought Daniel might treasure someday. There was a softness in Daniel's voice that made me ache. He said, "Mom, I've missed you." He asked if the second weekend in November worked. I said it was perfect. He said Vanessa would be happy to come. They'd bring the kids. I said, "I can't wait to see all of you." After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my house for a long time. Gerald's watch was still in his dresser drawer. That part, at least, was true. Over the following 3 weeks, I assembled everything. Robert organized the documentation into a clear, sequential binder. Cynthia at my bank provided a formal, notarized statement confirming there had been no incoming transfers to my account in the 3 years in question, save for those 2 early months. Howard added a supplementary note confirming the inquiry process. Phil sent a written summary of what he had seen on Daniel's laptop, along with his professional credentials, noting the discrepancy between Daniel's labeled account and my actual account number. Doris prepared the property record and the documentation linking Brianna Caldwell to Vanessa's family. Robert contacted a colleague in Indiana who was willing to look quietly into Ruth Caldwell's financial records, pending the appropriate authorizations. What that colleague found, and I won't get ahead of myself, was relevant. The trap, as Robert called it, wasn't cruel. It wasn't revenge. It was simply this: gather every piece of truth into one room with all the right people present, and then introduce it. Not with accusations, not with a speech, with documentation, because the one thing a calculated deceiver cannot counter is a paper trail that tells a clear, verifiable story. Robert would be there. He would be introduced as an old family friend, which was not entirely untrue. Doris would be there, and Phil was flying in from Minneapolis. Daniel would arrive thinking this was a family visit. He would leave knowing everything. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon. I watched them pull into the driveway from the kitchen window. Daniel got out first, and my heart did something complicated when I saw him. Because he looked tired in a way that went beyond lack of sleep. The kind of tired that comes from living with sustained tension. Liam tumbled out of the back seat and sprinted toward the door the way 7-year-olds do. Little Sophie was still half asleep, being lifted out by Vanessa. Vanessa. She looked exactly the same, polished, composed. She was wearing a cream-colored jacket and her hair was pulled back. When she saw me in the doorway, she smiled broadly and said, "Maggie, it's so good to be here." I smiled back. I hugged her. I hugged all of them. I had baked. There were cookies on the counter and a pot of coffee, and I had set the table with Gerald's good plates. The children ran to the living room where I'd put out some toys. Daniel sat at the kitchen table and exhaled in a way that told me he'd needed this. Vanessa looked around the kitchen with that particular quality of attention she had. Taking inventory I now recognized without appearing to. We talked for about 45 minutes about nothing important. The kids, Daniel's work, the drive, the weather. And then I said, "Daniel, there are a couple of people I've asked to stop by. I hope that's okay." He looked up. "Sure, who?" I said, "Robert Mace. You met him when your father died. He's been helping me with some paperwork. And Phil is in town." Daniel's face lit up at Phil's name. "Phil's here. You didn't tell me." Vanessa's expression changed, just slightly, just for a half second, but I had been watching her for a very long time now, and I saw it. Robert arrived first. Well, he set his briefcase by the door and shook hands with Daniel and nodded at Vanessa and went to the living room to say hello to the children. Doris came in through the side door, the way she always did. She sat down at the end of the table with her coffee and said nothing. Phil came last. When Daniel stood up to hug him, the two of them did that thing that old friends do, the kind of hug that carries years of history. Phil looked over Daniel's shoulder at me. I gave a small nod. We all sat down. Daniel looked around the table with a slightly puzzled expression. Pleasant, but curious. He said, "This feels like an intervention. Should I be worried?" I said, "I need to show you something." I placed the binder on the table, I said, "and I need you to look at everything in here before anyone says anything, all the way through." Please." Something shifted in the room. Vanessa said, "Maggie, what is this about?" I looked at her. I said, "I'll explain everything, but I need Daniel to read through this first." She said, "I don't understand why there's paperwork. We came to visit. Can this wait until—" Robert said, very quietly but very clearly, "Ms. Hartman, I think you should let him read it." Vanessa looked at Robert. Something crossed her face, recognition, calculation, and then she settled back into her chair and folded her hands on the table. Daniel opened the binder. The first page was the statement from my bank. Notarized. 3 years with no incoming transfers of any kind exceeding a few $100s. He read it. He looked up at me. I said nothing. He turned the page. But the second page was a printout of his own account's transfer history, the one Phil had helped him pull, with the destination account number circled, ending in 7741. Below it was a printout of my actual account information with my account number, ending in 2209. Daniel looked at those two numbers for a long time. He said, "These don't match." His voice was very flat. I said, "No." He said, "The money didn't go to you." I said, "No, Daniel, not one payment." He turned to Vanessa. She said, "Daniel, He said, "Hold on." He kept reading. Third page, the account ending in 7741 traced, through banking records Phil had helped request, to an account opened in the name of Brianna L. Caldwell. Fourth page, the property record from Scottsdale, Brianna Caldwell, owner, Vanessa Caldwell Hartman, mortgage cosigner. Fifth page, Doris's documentation of the family connection. Brianna Caldwell is Vanessa's sister. Daniel turned that page and just stopped. He didn't move. He didn't speak. The only sound in the room was Liam and Sophie playing in the next room, the small, cheerful sounds of children, completely unaware that their family was in the process of fracturing. Then Daniel said, without looking up from the binder, "Vanessa." Not a question, not an accusation yet, just her name. Said the way you say a word when you're testing whether it still means what you thought it meant. Vanessa said, "There's an explanation for all of this." Daniel looked up. His face was completely still. He said, "I'm listening." She said that the account, Brianna's account, was a holding account, and that she had set it up that way because she was trying to protect the money, because she wasn't sure I was managing money responsibly, and she wanted to make sure it was being used correctly. Daniel said, "Did you tell me that?" She said, "I was handling it, Daniel. I was protecting us." He said, "Did you tell me that?" Silence. She said, "You don't need to know every single detail of how I manage the accounts." He said, "Stop." And something in his voice, the single word, the absolute quiet of it, made her stop. He turned to me. He said, "Mom, when did the transfers stop?" I said, "After the first 2 months. Month 3, they stopped going to my account. They've gone to Brianna's account every month for 34 months. He did the math. I watched him do it. He closed his eyes. I said, "Daniel, there's more." He said, "I know there is." I turned to the last section of the binder. Robert's summary page, the concerns about Ruth. Daniel read it slowly. When he got to the part about the Indiana elder financial abuse referral, his jaw tightened. He looked at Vanessa. "Your mother," she said. "That is completely—" He said, "Is her money being managed through your accounts?" She said, "She asked me to help." He said, "Vanessa, she can't manage things on her own, Daniel. She's 81. Is her money going through your accounts?" Pause. "Some of it, yes, but—" He pushed his chair back from the table and stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to all of us for a long time, looking out at the driveway where the children's car seats were visible through the window. Dora set down her coffee cup. Out the sound of ceramic on wood was the only thing in the room. Vanessa said, "Daniel, please just let me explain this properly. Not like this. Not with everyone here." He turned around. He said, "Why do you think everyone is here?" She looked at me. I said, "Because you've spent 2 years making my son believe I was confused and forgetful and difficult. Because every time I tried to raise a concern, you'd already been there first, with a different story. I needed witnesses. I needed him to hear everything at once, with documentation so that there was no version of events where this could be explained away. I'm 68 years old, and I just lost my husband, and I have been living carefully. carefully on a pension while you sent my son's love and support to your sister's mortgage." The room was very still. Vanessa looked at me for a long moment. And then something left her face. The composure, the calculation, the warmth that I now recognized as performance. All of it went flat. She said, "You had no right to dig into our finances." Robert said, "Actually," she said, "I'm not speaking to you." Robert said, "That's fine. The Financial Crimes Unit of the FBI has been notified, and the Indiana Adult Protective Services has been notified. You can choose who you'd like to speak to." Daniel made a sound. Not a word. Not a sob. Something between the two. He looked at me across the table, and his eyes were full of something I hadn't seen in 3 years. The real him. The one who called me from 1,400 miles away and said, "Dad would have wanted this." He said, "Mom, I'm so sorry." I said, "I know." Vanessa left the house that afternoon. She didn't stay for dinner. She didn't say goodbye to the children. The children don't fully understand what happened. Liam knows that his parents are going through a separation. Sophie is 4. She knows that Grandma Maggie makes good cookies. In the months that followed, the legal process moved forward methodically. Robert coordinated with the Financial Crimes Unit. The transfers to the Brianna Caldwell account were documented fully. The total redirected from Daniel's account over 34 months was $81,600. The 2 months that had arrived in my account were apparently test periods, just as I had suspected. Brianna Caldwell cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. She provided documentation showing that Vanessa had directed the funds and that she had been told the arrangement was legitimate, a family support account. Investigators found that Vanessa had also been withdrawing funds from Ruth Caldwell's estate account, approximately $34,000 over 22 months. Ruth, when told, reportedly said, and this comes from her care facility staff, "I always thought it seemed like I had less money than I should." Vanessa was charged with multiple counts of wire fraud and elder financial abuse. Her attorney negotiated a plea agreement. She received 3 years of probation, was ordered to pay full restitution, and is subject to financial monitoring for 5 years. The $81,600 directed to the Brianna account, the portion that could be recovered, was returned to Daniel, and Daniel transferred every dollar of it to me. He also came back, not just the money. I mean, my son came back. The Daniel who called me short and careful and distant for 2 years, that person was created by someone else's narrative. Stripped of that narrative, he called me every few days again. He brought the children for Christmas. He sat in Gerald's old chair in the living room, and we talked for 3 hours one night about nothing and everything. And Liam fell asleep on my couch, and Sophie held my hand, and it felt like the world had returned something it had briefly stolen. As for Ruth, the Indiana facility connected her with a patient advocate who now reviews all her financial arrangements. She is protected, she is safe. Doris and I still have coffee on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Phil was in my kitchen when the call came through about Vanessa's plea agreement. He sat there and said, "You knew from the beginning, didn't you, that it was her?" I said, "No, I knew something was wrong. Those are very different things." He thought about that. He said, "What made you keep going when you could have just let it be?" I said, "My husband sent me love letters for 43 years. He never had more than $30,000 in savings at one time. The idea that someone could take what my son sent with love and route it into a Scottsdale condo while making him think I was losing my mind, no, I couldn't let that be. I want to tell you something I've been thinking about since all of this ended. The cruelest part of what Vanessa did wasn't the money. I want to be clear about that. Fuck the money was devastating in practical terms. 3 years of living more tightly than I needed to, skipping things. worrying in the middle of the night in a way you carry differently when you're alone, and the person you shared everything with for 43 years is gone. That was real. That hurt. But the cruelest part was the story she told. The story she built about me, that I was confused, unreliable, forgetting conversations, not managing things well. That story was designed to do one thing specifically. It was designed to make the person who loved me most begin to see me as a problem rather than a person. And it worked. For 2 years, it worked. I have thought about how many people in this world are in the same position I was in. Elderly, widowed, at a point in life where they depend on others. Be surrounded by people who genuinely love them and who have someone in their circle quietly, systematically rerouting not just their money, but their credibility. Building a case that they're unreliable before they ever get the chance to raise an alarm. It's not a dramatic crime. There's no violence, there's no confrontation. It happens over months and years, one small distortion at a time, one slightly wrong account number, one fabricated phone call, one careful conversation designed to plant a seed of doubt. The only defense I had was the same defense anyone has. I paid attention to what didn't add up. I found people I trusted and I told them the truth. I didn't react emotionally when I could act strategically instead. And I never, not once, let the story being told about me become the story I told about myself. If there is someone in your life right now who seems to be slowly separating you from someone you love, building a version of you that serves their interests, not yours, pay attention to that. Please, pay attention to that. And if you are the person being separated from someone you love, by stories and doubts and carefully managed information, ask to see the paperwork. That's all. Just ask to see the paperwork. Gerald used to say that good people don't need to control information. He said honest people don't mind the question. He said, Maggie, the moment someone gives you a reason not to look, look. He was right about almost everything, that man. He was right about that too. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.